I've also hit record, looking at my waveform. I think I'm in good shape.
Hmm.
All right.
Do you want to hand over during the basic crawl, actually, because this is quite long.
I did. Yeah, I highlighted in yellow where I want you to pick it up.
Is that
And,
worth switching?
and then I re-highlighted in fuchsia where I'm going to pick it up. So,
Okay, cool.
and then a lot of our things we liked are similar. Like I think they kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
piggyback off each other. So I'll just let you. I'll throw to you on that, and then I'll just pick up with mine as needed. So.
Hmm.
And then I also like I do like putting I think the question about the under no circumstances should the party be allowed to dig up Sir Hooger's body. I think that's actually really great for the questions we had. I think it's substantively more interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I've moved that up into that
okay,
section. Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Because I realized actually the expert delve is very focused, and so some of the stuff I have is about converting to World of Dungeons, and that the other two things
Yeah.
were not. So I've moved them out of it to keep it in one like strand of
Okay,
discussion.
cool. Yeah, I think that's all. I think the way it looks right now is
Mm.
good. Should work well. Yeah, I have like really specific things I want to say during the expert delve. So
I've noticed. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I do this a lot. So like I'm like
Yeah.
it is like I feel like this is the opportunity to talk about this, right? So because the
Mhm.
module is just so, right? Like it's not anything to write
Yeah, I
home
mean, it's
about.
better than I expected. But oh well, let's talk
Yeah,
about
it's
this in that
okay.
case.
It's
Yeah.
okay. I mean, like, I don't think it's like amazing, but it's got a couple. But I think it's suitably generic to like talk about World of Dungeons conversion, and I've done it, so I think that that's why
Yeah.
it's kind of like really salient to me right now, and I just finished it. So okay, well, I've been recording for a while, so let's do our clapping.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, oh yeah.
All right, hold on 1 second. I think I'm looking good. Okay, here we go. Let me look at my waveform while we do this. 1, 2, 3. My name is Jason,
My name is Tom,
and this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
and in this episode, we brave a dragon-haunted mountain range as we venture into the fire.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Into the Fire is one of the adventures in the first issue of Dungeon Magazine. That's the one with the big iconic red dragon illustration on the cover. That issue of Dungeon was published in 1986. It was written by Grant and David Boucher. It was Grant Boucher's first published work. I suspect this was the case with many Dungeon authors, actually. Grant would go on to write many supplements for role playing games, as well as having a career in Hollywood working on different aspects of production. I had less luck finding out anything about David Boucher. Maybe he just went on to be an accountant or something. I don't know. In any case, Into the Fire is pitched as an AD&D module for 6 to 10 characters, each of 6th to 10th level. That's crazy. The module takes place against the following backdrop. Some years ago, a young prince named Lomarin was kidnapped by pirates on his way to university. The pirates were then attacked by a red dragon, Flame, who carried the pirate ship and its contents back to its mountainous lair. Closer to present day, a group of knights looking for refuge from a winter storm disturbed the dragon's lair. The knights were all killed by the dragon except one, who managed to escape with a silver necklace that belonged to the young Prince Lomarin. The knights didn't make it home, but instead died on, or the night, sorry, Paul. The knight didn't make it home, but instead died on the doorstep of some Sverfneblin, which are deep gnomes in D&D parlance. The Sverfneblin dragged his body and the silver necklace to the local human castle, Fort Silent. The necklace was then sent along to the king. The module begins with the party at an audience with the king. He needs their help to discover what happened to his son, as well as to assess this new threat in the mountains, which claims the... God damn it, sorry, Paul. He needs their help to discover what happened to his son, as well as to assess this new threat in the mountains which claim the lives of these knights.
And from that point, assuming the party takes the job, the adventure actually begins. The module starts with a description of all the ways the DM can prevent the party from, quote unquote, cheating on this adventure. Can they fly or teleport? Well, encourage them strongly to stick close to the ground, or maybe they'll miss vital clues. Spoiler, they will not. Can they scry? Forget about that. Flame the Dragon has powerful anti-scrying magic, and so on. And we're then given a couple of maps, a basic one for the players to find, and a more detailed kind of one for the DM. The text then provides the various types of encounters the party could have in the foothills and the mountainous areas, both by day and night as they travel. And then comes an encounter key, which contains descriptive bits, stats for the major encounters on this mission, which are Fort Silan or Silan, don't know how you want to say that, where the knight's body was taken by the Deep Gnomes, whose D&D name I cannot pronounce. Roaring Peak Pass, an avalanche trap set by some Geleb Dur, which have rock trolls of some description. Again, I don't really know. The massive Lake Darien, Mount Torch, an active volcano, a wolf were named Liscales or Liscales, and his pack of winter wolves, a rocky pass, Lake Haven, the Big Valley, the Deep Gnome Settlement, the statue of the child, and the pass of the parents, which are some historical landmarks. And finally, Fort Whelan. The Lake Haven portion of the encounter key has its own map and is much more detailed than the other sections, because this is where the climactic encounters take place. Lake Haven is a crater inside of which is a lake, a partially submerged leaning tower, and a cave system that is Flame the Dragon's lair. Flame's lair has its own maps, a cutaway that carefully shows how some of the traps and other mechanics of the lair work, and a regular top-down map.
There is an extensive amount of information and detail about Flame's lair in the text, including everything you could possibly want to know about how the dragon behaves in combat, as well as his treasure hoard. The module also has a lot of information about a tower in the crater lake. It has its own map as well, along with accompanying text that explains what is in each level of the tower. The module concludes with advice about how the adventure might be continued, particularly if the party obtained sorry, Paul, particularly if the party obtained certain documents from the pirate ship that was in the dragon's lair, whether they encounter the deep gnomes or if they are inclined to track down the missing prince. So let's talk about things we liked about the module. I'll throw to you first, Tom. What'd you like about Into the Fire?
I like the central mystery of what Flame the Dragon is. When the PCs start out, one of the things they know is that they don't know anything, because they can't use their powerful scrying magic to figure out what's going on. And that presumably implies that there's some powerful counter magics at work, which then presumably sets the imagination racing. Is it a very powerful evil wizard? Is it a dragon of some sort? And actually, I don't know enough about standard D&D settings to be able to do that. And I think this is kind of the upper limit of setting mastery being fun as a way of trying to work out what's going on. And I think as you go along, you sort of uncover more clues and maybe false leads as well. Is that, yeah, that's right. There's a thing about the white dragon, for example. Am I remembering this correctly? I should have.
Yeah, the mystery is one of the things I like to, the main thing that the party is doing is they're advancing along this trail, trying to figure out what happened to these knights. And the module does what I think is a really clever thing. Maybe it's just clever through the prism of being very familiar with D&D, I'm not sure, but I think it's very clever in that the module does certain things to both give you sort of misdirect about what is actually happening, that it's actually a red dragon, right? So for example, the knight that escapes and dies at Fort Silam, Sir Huger or whatever his name is, he, his body is described as having suffered from both frostbite and burns, right? And so you're immediately thinking well, there's something like that, there's some combination of those things that killed him. As you go into the snowy mountain range, you also realize that there's a volcano in the mountain range. And so that might make you think, oh, well, maybe that's how he got burned, because he got hit by lava or something, right? But those misdirects in their way are also clues about what's really going on, right? So for example, you mentioned the white dragon thing. There's an elf that kind of mentions a rumor about a white dragon, and that gets you thinking about dragons, but just the wrong kind of dragon, right? Why might a red dragon be in a snowy mountain range? If you know D&D, that's not where they hang out. Except this one has a volcano, which is a clue in its way, right? And so is therefore more comfortable for the red dragon. It's very, very if you love D&D and you know D&D, these clues are going to sing for you, right?
Yeah, and this is for people who are playing characters of levels 6 to 10, so they presumably love
They've
D&D.
had some time, yeah.
I think it's also pretty good because it's a fair misdirection in that, for example, a white dragon is not a lower order of threat than a red dragon. So it's not like you're going to just stroll right ahead going, well, it's only a white dragon, no problem. And that, I think, means that you can't really be fooled by the misdirection. You can only be perhaps surprised by the reality.
Well, allow me to push my glasses up on my
Oh,
nose and say, well, actually, Tom, white
um,
dragons are significantly weaker than red dragons, as it turns out. They are the lowest in terms of power of the chromatic dragons. Nevertheless, a white dragon is not to be trifled with. You are correct.
that's
Sorry.
me told. Wow.
I just totally gave you like me at age 14 just then. So
Yeah, yeah. I think I've just lost the podcast. Like 50% of its listeners. Like, this guy doesn't even know about white dragons. Anyway, so
continue. No, the mystery. The mystery is great. Yeah, I agree completely. What else did you like about it?
well, I like the clear simplicity of the map that is the player handout almost as much as I dislike the DM map, which is kind of useless.
It's a bad DM map. Yeah, what's the point of it even? Yeah.
It's like just a grainier version of the players one, which is like one trail that you have to follow into the
Right.
mountains.
Why is there even a map? I know it's a little
Well,
weird.
there
Yeah.
is a reason actually, because it has some statues marked on it, and those are pretty tantalizing. And I reckon
And also
anyone would go and check them
nothing.
out.
Yeah.
But I think they also will lead you to the deep gnome lair if you go that way. If I'm not
True.
mistaken.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I think that's what it's for.
The map is not totally useless. You're right. The DM's one is it's basically the same as the player one, and it's less readable. I'm not sure what
Yeah.
the purpose of having the two maps is. That was unclear to me.
No.
No, you're right. Yeah, the player's map is pretty good. Anything else?
Yeah, I like the wolfware. I mean, I just find the word wolfware quite amusing to say and think about anyway. But so just for clarity, this is a wolf that turns into a human. Is that right? Or
A wolf were is the reverse of a werewolf,
right?
obviously.
Yeah. Okay. And he's a kind of roguish trickster figure who seems like just the kind of murderous pest who would be great to have him to sort of make this brief appearance, maybe try to kill the PCs, and then keep turning up at later dates going, hello, and just
Right, yeah.
So he's a fun character for a GM to have around. And speaking of fun things, there's a note in weirdly the Leaning Tower is this structure that Flame knocked over that belonged to a wizard who used to live in the lake, right? And it's a kind of whole little pocket dungeon that's contained within the scenario that has no bearing on anything else whatsoever, but it's just in there.
Yeah, yeah. The module is really interesting in that way, in that even though it has a pretty like lean amount of space to work with, I think the whole thing with illustrations is like 10 pages or 12 pages or something. And and yet it has like certain details that are clearly just like this is just the world sort of details, which I actually like. I think it adds a certain level of like authenticism, you know? Like that leaning tower doesn't have to have anything in it, right? It's just a leaning tower that's a bit of history. Same thing with the statues that I think we're going to talk about later. Um, yeah, there's not a huge purpose for the tower. It's
No, I
mostly
like
just
it, but
a distraction.
it does have a purpose though, because there's a note that leads to an interesting fail state. Like if you totally get your asses kicked by the dragon, he may not kill you because there's a note that says, hang on, let me put this, has spent many years pillaging the tower because he's too big to get inside, right? By using captive humans and demi-humans. So your player characters get caught and become indentured dungeoneers working for a dragon that's going to eat them once they've finished finding all the treasure.
It's
That's
pretty
good.
good. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that I like the way the mystery works in this one, the other big thing I love about this module is the dragon encounter itself. The whole sequence with Flame is the pièce de résistance of this module, in my opinion. There's a huge amount of detail given over to how Flame behaves in combat. It's almost choreographed. And I really like that. And it's particularly helpful for World of Dungeons style play, where we're more concerned about fictional positioning than we are hit points and things. It's nice to have this very rich detail about how Flame behaves. I think it's super helpful in running that combat encounter. It gives you a lot to play with in terms of fictional positioning, which, like I said, is so important in Wodu. And kind of piggybacking off that, the level of detail of the dragon's hoard is ridiculous in a good way. It's so freaking detailed. I mean, virtually every gold piece is accounted for. Okay, like every art object, every magic item in fantastic detail. I want to say it's like 2 pages
Yeah.
of like multi-column text detail of the dragon's hoard. It's more detail than the whole wilderness part of the adventure, you know.
Yeah, but I guess that's a way of making it feel like a really good reward for having, got there. Or at least it's just interesting stuff to hide behind while you're trying not to get killed by a dragon at the
I
end of
think
that
I
part.
think it was just fetishistic on the author's part. I mean, like
Yeah.
you just got the distinct impression I did from reading it that the authors just like loved sitting down and detailing every little aspect of the horde. I mean, it's something else. But I really like it though. There's I'll mention it later, but in Chain Lightning, but the horde itself feels like a lived in space almost because of the extensive
Yeah,
detail of everything
yeah.
you find in there. So yeah, pretty
Yeah.
cool.
But yeah, I also liked the fight sequence, the way it's presented as a kind of this is your problem now, like at different points in the cave complex, and here are a few things that the PCs are likely to try and do about it, and then it gives you, well, I mean, they're not spot rules; they're just kind of explaining how the rules will apply to this, like if they try and jump on this bit of a ledge or do this, that, and the other. And yeah, so I think that's like a good. Honestly, you could just cut directly to that fight sequence, and you probably have a pretty good scenario by
You
itself.
definitely, yeah. It is kind of like I said, it is like the big thing. You're right. It's pretty cool. What about questions we had? I know you had a few.
Yeah, I've got a few that are basically complaints phrased as questions, and then we'll get into some real ones.
I like those types of questions where I know the answer, but I still just complain about
Okay.
it.
Why do I need to know about how the lake drains into the local water table?
Who knows?
Okay.
There's no reason.
What is the deal with information that can only be gained by ESP?
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. You're talking about the one particular part with Lyscales or Lascales, I don't know how to pronounce his name,
Yeah.
the Wolfware, we'll
Yeah.
say, where he, if you beat him up and convince him or otherwise like do your various charisma checks or whatever you have to do to get him to tell you something, he will tell you thing X, which is a lie. And the truth can only be learned explicitly in the text, can only be learned with ESP. A very strange detail, I agree. The only thing I could come up with is it is a sop or a bone thrown to your characters who may be good at scrying an ESP, because otherwise those powers are of no use, right? In the adventure.
That
That's the
is
only thing I could come up with. I don't know. What do you
okay.
think?
That's probably it. Yeah, it just seemed, yeah,
It's a little
pointless.
random and weird, though. I agree.
Yeah. Um, Also, yeah, right. So this is maybe this is the first genuine question. So the authors spend a bit of time fretting at the beginning, as you say, that things might go wrong if the player characters use all their amazingly good magic. But from reading, this seems pretty bulletproof. I mean, there's not that many complex different bits that need to interact. There's no timelines at work. There's a giant freaking dragon at the end. I mean, you've run this. Could anything have gone wrong, really?
So we talk about the way I ran it. So
Oh,
the fundamental mystery of Into the Fire was not a big part of when I ran it. It was 5 sessions, mind you. It was not a big part of it. They figured out it was a dragon right away, and the reason why I went ahead and just like let them know it was a red dragon right away, and whatever, and however it came up in the fiction, is because the way I advertised the event, they know it's an adventure from the first issue of Dungeon Magazine. They know there's a dragon on the cover of the magazine. They knew it was going to happen. It's called Into the Fire. I mean, so I had no like there was no real like there was never going to be a big like ta-da surprise thing in my game about there being a dragon at the end, right? So I just leaned into it, didn't worry about it. I have to imagine the reason why they emphasize like the no scrying, no detection, like you can't figure out it's a dragon until you actually see it. I think the reason why that's emphasized is because I think the authors do intend for this to be a big surprise, right? I think the characters, the players, the out of fiction players are meant to be pondering and wondering and puzzling over these clues and what could be waiting for them at the end. And as someone steeped in D&D, I will tell you that it reads like it would lend itself to a conversation at the table where the players are all like, "Oh my God, is it a dragon? There's no way it's a red dragon. The red dragon's that's the most powerful terrestrial being on in the monstrous manual. There's no way it's a red dragon." And then boom, it is a red dragon, right? Like I think they're going for that effect.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's pitched directly at. I mean, this only works as a mystery on people who have played a lot of D&D.
Who
Because
know D&D really
yeah,
well? Yeah,
if you're a novice, like you start out and they go, I mean, maybe it's a red dragon, a dragon that breathes fire. That's probably what you're thinking.
Yeah, exactly right. But that doesn't have the same like to a steeped in D&D player, like an ancient red dragon is a big fucking deal, right? Like that's a big deal. And yeah, I mean I get just a little tingly even talking about it right now because of my sort of, you know, my sense
Massive
memories,
knowledge.
of D&D. Um I think that's what it is. I think they really intend for that to be a big thing. And it kind of makes sense if you think about this as the first module or one of the first modules in the first issue of Dungeon Magazine. I think they were going for like big ticket love letter to D&D, right? That's
Mm,
what it felt like.
yeah. Interesting. Okay, back to a slightly technical question. So glasses at the ready to be pushed up noses. Normally, when I'm running something from D&D and putting it into World of Dungeons, I don't bother looking up what the magic items do because I have a name and that's normally enough, right? Like
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
ring of invisibility, makes you invisible.
That's
It's a ring,
pretty easy,
whatever.
right? Yeah.
However, in this case, because the scenario goes on quite a lot about the mechanics of where it's located and stuff, I looked at the Rod of Alertness, and it says the rod senses any creature within 120 feet who intends to harm the possessor. So, am I wrong here? I don't think that is ever going to ping and alert the dragon because the motivation of the PCs at almost no point is to harm the dragon.
Right. I know it's a weird move. Um yeah, you're right. I was thinking about it. This is not how it went down in my game. The way I handled it was if it made sense for the dragons to know the PCs were there, if the dragon could somehow spy on them or see them, I just let them know. Like to me, I don't think I didn't
Yeah,
give
I
a
mean, I
shit.
would just run it as the dragon can hear them because it is has
'Cause-
amazing hearing or
right,
something.
yeah. Yeah, the rod of alertness is a weird move. There might be something buried deep in the sort of like technical back and forth of first edition AD&D that I'm forgetting, that makes the rod of alertness a particularly important piece of the puzzle for Flame, but I am not seeing it. So
Yeah. Okay, more questions. I don't think the scenario needs a DM's map. Do you?
nope.
I don't think it even needs a map, maybe, but except for the dragon lair, you know.
Yeah, not really. No,
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how you approach it, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that one was easy. All right. Here's a good question. Again, not really phrased as a question, except for, do you agree with me? Right. There's a line in the scenario that says, "Under no circumstances should the party be allowed to dig up Sir Hoyer's body." That's the knight who's comes back with the clue that leads to the adventure, right?
Listeners who I've been pronouncing Huger, in case you're confused right
Oh,
now.
I thought he might be Dutch. Okay, yeah,
No, no, you might be right. I was like, wait, who? Yeah. No, you might be totally right. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it
yeah,
wrong.
who knows? I couldn't disagree more about this. I think they absolutely should be encouraged to try and dig up a knight's body because there's a little thread of, well, just a couple of scenes in the scenario I think are interesting, and as written, it makes sure they never see it. So to begin with, the story gets kicked off by a sad procession of strange grey gnomes bringing an armed knight to a giant to them castle. But the PCs never get to see that. They just get a job offer from a local potentate, right? I'd like them to be present for that. That would be pretty cool. I think it's an interesting scene. And then yeah, without forcing the issue too much, because I was sorry, let's not railroad people. I would want there to be a strict taboo on going anywhere near the body or touching it, and have like the knight lying in state at the castle and then being buried, and they're like, no digging out the body, no touching the body, even if you think there are vital clues. And then, of course, much like in the film The Reckoning, they can go into a kind of clandestine exhumation to check for burns and wounds and stuff.
I agree completely. I agree completely. Again, the only thing I can think of why they wanted to keep that under wraps is for the mystery, the big red dragon reveal to unfurl in a certain way. But I agree. Some of the most interesting parts of the whole thing are not on screen for the players, right? Like the whole like backstory of Prince Lomarin, which has no other bearing on the module, by the way.
That's right.
Um,
That is quite a long intro for what the man
yeah, it's like,
can
yeah,
go.
the whole thing
Also,
with
I'm
Prince,
interested in my son.
yeah,
So
Prince Lomarin and the pirate Jalusa the Merciless. There's all this stuff, and it has like literally no bearing on how the adventure plays out. Um, yeah, you said like the procession of deep gnomes, all that stuff is really cool, and it has like no, and it's just never anything that happens on screen for the players. I agree with you. I love the idea of the player characters investigating the body and learning a little bit more about what might be going on. I think it doesn't mean you have to tell them everything, right? You don't have to say, oh, this clearly looks like intense burns from dragon fire. I mean, you don't have to go that far, but I think just letting them see it. When I
yeah,
ran it, when I ran it, I told them the story. Like I had an NPC at Fort Silent tell them the story of the gnomes, and they liked it. Like I think it really like kind of because the way I presented it was I had the king. The king didn't have all the information. The king told the king's understanding was that the knight died in a certain way, and when they got to Fort Silent, they got the real story about the deep gnomes.
Oh,
And I think
yeah,
it was a
okay.
good move. So,
Cool.
let's go.
Okay. Oh, oh,
I'm sorry.
sorry. You do the transition. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just sorry, sorry, Paul. So let's go to the chain lightning round. I'll start. In the treasure hoard, there's this pot of gold with some leprechaun bones, and if you mess with it, you might a rainbow comes out. You might summon some leprechauns to your space. It's such a weird, ridiculous detail of the treasure hoard about this whole like leprechaun subplot, but I'm kind of here for it. Going back to my love of this absurd, ridiculous treasure hoard detail, it's filled with like little mini side quests and adventures in a way, right? And that's just one of them. So yeah, leprechauns randomly showing up in the finale of your adventure.
My number one is the fire giants. When you bump into them, are well, if you bump into them at night, they are cooking a young rock when you meet them, which I find is a nice little detail in the giants eat giant things mold that you find in like kids' books and the Chronicles of Narnia and stuff like that.
In the Leaning Tower, you can find this, frankly, ridiculous talking sword called Mironis. The sword, the way the sword is characterized in the text, and the way I think you're supposed to play it, is it's very neurotic in its behavior, and it has like intense abandonment issues. Like it feels like it needs you. It does not want to be left alone. Like it's kind of a weird little detail. I kind of love it.
There are not that many illustrations in the scenario, but the one of the first is a very stark, high contrast black and white illustration of the fortress, and it has a wonderfully kind of unwelcoming wilderness feel to its kind of general setting. And I thought it was a very good scene set. I'd show that to the players, I think, at the very beginning of the session.
And that was my last one too. That illustration of Fort Salem is really good because you see Roaring Peak Pass and Mount Torch in the background. Just showing that to the player characters creates a certain expectation, right? It even like gives a little clue, like, oh, there might be a volcano, right? Like maybe that has something to do with it. It's pretty effective. It's good. It's just a good illustration too.
Um, uh, sorry, Paul. And my last one is quite similar to your first one, which is I like that the Dragon's Hoard includes an entire pirate ship that it flew off with and brought back to the mountain.
Right, I know. The Dragon's Hoard is really off the scales and so wild.
Yeah, it's great.
Let's go to the expert delve.
Actually, I'll enter this because you've got a lot of talking to do.
Indeed, please.
So this episode's expert delve is on adapting the module and modules like it to World of Dungeons. That is John Harper's stripped down faux 1979 version of Dungeon World. Jason, take it away.
So, adapting to World of Dungeons. At the outset, I think you have to acknowledge. Sorry. At the outset, I think you have to acknowledge some basic tensions. World of Dungeons is more collaborative in nature. That's mostly because it's a more modern take on the fantasy genre. And World of Dungeons style play emphasizes narrative beats more than strictly following the module from A to Z. And so I think you have to kind of acknowledge that up front and understand that those tensions with are going to like those two things are going to be in tension. They're going to conflict with just running the module straight, right? So that's worth keeping in mind at the outset. Piggybacking off that, this is some advice that's not specific to World of Dungeons, but I think it's worth talking about here. In the beginning, I prefer to just get on with it. Like I just want to get onto the adventure. I don't care about meeting in an inn, having an audience with the king. I don't give a shit about any of that. Again, this is going back to the idea of narrative beats, story beats being more important, pacing being more important than just like strictly saying what the module tells you, or strictly doing what the module tells you to do, right? And so what I would do, and this is indeed what I did do, I would just like remove entirely the meeting with the king. Um, it's something that has just already happened. They are on their way, and that's it. Right. So they are just it's I call it hard framing. They are hard framed on the mission. They are going. I start off with an in medias res encounter. I'll talk about that in a second. But I think importantly, like just kind of getting on with it is a really good thing to do. Now, here's the thing. This may feel like too hard of a frame, right? The player characters or the players didn't get a chance to say yes or no to the king's request, right? They are just doing it, right? What I do in all my games, because I do tend to do this, I kind of hard frame them up, push them right toward the adventure, is I use sets of establishing questions to let the players personalize the adventure a little bit and to let them feel like they have some agency in the story. I think that's very, very important. And so here's some examples that I did in my game when I ran it. These are questions that I posed. I posed each of these to one of the player characters. You have a suspicion that the ship of Jalusa the Merciless might also be found somewhere in those mountains, given the strange circumstances. Why is it so important that you find the ship? Why do you also fear the ship will be the death of you? Next question. King Lomar is offering coin in exchange for this information about the knights, and a princely sum for those who bring him physical evidence of what happened to Lomarin. But you don't care about the coin. You intend to extract a different price from King Lomar. What is it? You believe a terrible and ancient spirit resides within that mountain range. What rumors have you heard about this spirit? Why do you wish to commune with it? And finally, you have a close personal connection to one of the missing knights. Tell me about him or her. What was the nature of this relationship? So by using those questions, I give the players an opportunity to build out the fic. I give them an opportunity to have some control over their player characters' agency and desires and motivations, and also just gives me stuff to kind of flesh things out with a bit too.
Sure, and I think it's also worth noting that these are all kind of, well, side quests, you might call them, or things that will extend beyond the adventure in some cases. But crucially, they don't mess with the central dynamic of the scenario, right? None of them are, you're secretly working for the dragon and you're going to kill
Right,
everyone,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. They enhance rather than like conflict for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think just to kind of address the issue of the meeting with the king, right? The reason that is in there is because it's assuming a maybe ongoing campaign so that people have the choice to, oh, we don't want to do this adventure, we're going to go over there and fight those goblins. But the thing is, when your players did this, they did have a choice because they read the summary of the adventure and they signed up for it online.
Right, yeah,
So,
true. Yeah.
so in a way, you are combining there is a best of both worlds here, where you can choose the adventure and still cut to the chase and not have to have the 20-minute scene where we pretend we might not do the adventure talking to the king. And what I do is I'll literally make a spreadsheet with the name of the adventure and a little paragraph about it, and just right at the beginning of the session or even during the week, the players will just decide what they're going to do. So that's the choosing to do the adventure part, and then we cut to the on the road. We're already doing the adventure, and we don't have to faff around unless we feel like it with bickering over prices with local kings.
Which I suppose someone might be into, but
Oh yeah, well, to be honest, bickering over prices for local kings, it does crop up a lot, but only because we want to, and that's the important thing.
Indeed, indeed. No, I agree. I do it because of just the nature of the way I schedule games, but absolutely, if you're doing an ongoing campaign, there's no reason why you can't hard frame and then just give the players an opportunity to sort of like create some agency and fill in the fiction a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about things that are mechanically specific to World of Dungeons. Two overarching principles I have for you here to keep in mind. The first is what I like to say, the die of fate rules all. Okay, we'll talk about that. The second is dramatic beats are more important than numbers. Okay, I keep those two big principles in my mind as I'm sitting down to think about a module, and indeed while I am running the adventure. The die of fate. In World of Dungeons, there's a mechanic called the die of fate. If you blink, you'll miss it, honestly. It's like a paragraph, but it's a short rule set, so whatever. What it is a d6. And whenever you the way I use it at least, whenever you get into a new encounter, you talking to a new person, you just need chance to determine something. You roll the die of fate, and higher results are better for the player characters, and lower results are better for the well, not better, but they are tougher for the player characters, right? I was about to say better for the GM, but that's weird. Lower results means a tough encounter. Higher results means an easier encounter with a spectrum in the middle, right? It's a little bit intuitive. As the GM, you kind of have to go on your gut a little bit. Like when you roll the die of fate and you get a four, well, what does a four mean? Well, you got to think a little bit about the context of what's happening and figure out what a four means, right? Um, but when you get used to using the die of fate as a GM, it becomes a really powerful tool in ways I'm going to talk about later. But just keep the die of fate in mind. All right. So, and of course, dramatic beats are more important than numbers. That's a pithy way of just saying that I think in World of Dungeons and more modern games, I think it's less important that we see the stats versus stats back and forth between monsters and NPCs. I just don't think that's super important. I think it's more important to see the big, dramatic, exciting things in the combat and kind of focus on those. Right. So we talked about the in medias res. I mentioned it briefly earlier. What I do for the in medias res, very first thing that the player characters do, I roll the die of fate, okay, and then I pick an appropriate encounter from the wilderness encounter table. I'm speaking of Into the Fire specifically here. They have that wilderness encounter table. I roll the die of fate, and if it's a 1, I pick the hardest thing on there. If it's a 6, I pick the easiest thing on there, or maybe don't have an encounter at all, or the encounter is more social in nature, or something like that. You play with it a little bit. But the reason why I do it that way is because even though I'm not rolling on the encounter table and doing the procedure that the module would have you do, I'm still picking something, and so I'm therefore still getting sort of Into the Fire canon speak, right? Like I'm getting the flavor of Into the Fire using my die of fate method of determining what happens. I always make the die of fate rolls public. I think that's a fun part of using the die of fate. And this first in medias res encounter is a great opportunity to show what that looks like. You kind of explain to the players what you're about to do. You say, all right, we're going to start with a little fight. Let's see how tough that fight's going to be. You roll the die of fate, and then if it's a 1, they all like shudder, right? And if it's a 6, they feel more confident and they're a little bit more daring and dashing in their narration, right? So it's good stuff. Yeah. So what do you think about that? Just as a general thought about starting the mission.
I think starting off immediately with something happening is a good practice, not only because it's engaging in a story way, but actually mechanically as well, especially if people have not played the game before. It's a good way to just try out the mechanics and stuff in a low risk way, relatively. Although actually World of Dungeons characters die fairly easily as well, so maybe it's
They
not that
do.
low risk. And that's true. I especially like the thing about making it public. I often forget to do that when I'm playing online because sometimes I use real dice, but I will always say what I just rolled and I don't lie, so that's the same thing. And then the difficulty though is, okay, so 1 is bad for them-ish, 6 is good. 3s and 4s though, I don't know, man. It's like sometimes I think the die of fate is almost an internal thing for me. Like, if you can't decide between two things and you flip a coin, and then if you think, oh, maybe I should make it best 2 out of 3, that's the clue that you really wanted the heads thing and not the tails thing, right? It's a way of finding out what's the correct answer. So in some cases, when I get 3 or 4, I'm just sort of do what I was thinking of originally is the answer.
I think that's the way it goes for me too. A 3 or 4 is kind of like as written almost, right? Or as written either on the paper or in your mind, right? And a 1 or 2 demands that you think tougher, right? And a 5 or 6, demands that you ease up or you even give them an opportunity or a treasure or something, right? I think that's right. I mean, I think what you've described just now is the sort of the process, right, of working with the die of fate, which is really, really fun once you get the hang of it. I'll put one little note because you brought it up, and I think it's worth saying. I ran first level characters through Into the Fire. Okay, first level Wodu characters, paper thin, right? They die easy, paper thin, right? When they get to zero, I actually do like a little sort of Dungeon World style, Black Hack style, like last breath procedure. So it's not like
Uh,
definite death when they go to
okay,
zero.
yeah.
But nevertheless, the wilderness encounters on these tables are intense as fuck. I think like one of
Yeah,
them is
they are
like
nuts.
20 ogres or something, right? Like oh, you just run into 20 ogres. Um, Dial that back, right? Like 20 ogres doesn't have to be, it may, instead of 20 ogres, maybe on a, on a two or three or a four, maybe it's a couple ogres, right? On a five, maybe it's one ogre. On a six, maybe it's just the leavings of ogres that they can rifle through. On a one, maybe it's like you want to go really tough. Then maybe it's a big group of ogres, five, six, seven ogres, and the goal then is not to fight them but to run away, right?
Sure.
Like
Oh, go on.
no, that's all I have to say.
All right. Or a variant on that though is like you could have it be a 20 plus ogres is fine if they're kind of sedentary, if they're busy living their lives, and you've got maybe five or six actively dangerous ogres. That's a little bit different. And then of course there's the extra threat of what if you after you. Also, World of Dungeons handles running away rolls quite well, so
It does indeed, yeah.
that's got a bit
Well,
of advantages.
and that's a terrific insight because, and I think this is a big difference between running D&D versus running World of Dungeons, which is World of Dungeons often is more about problem solving than combat, right? And it does problem solving really, really well. And so, yeah, you're right. Like, so maybe it is 20 ogres, but like you said, there are 20 ogres at camp. There are 20 ogres that they just see in the distance, and they have to figure out a way of like circumventing them or whatever. Play with it, but don't put your low level, even medium to high level World of Dungeons characters in a scrap with 20 ogres because it will be rough.
Yeah.
The system does not scale well in that sense. Um, so I mentioned it. I've kind of been alluding to it already, but let's talk about tables. Encounter tables are a big part of these old school modules, and I let the Die of Fate handle all of that in a way very similar to what I've just described. I roll the Die of Fate, sometimes to determine whether there's an encounter at all, and if there is, I just pick something from the table, adjusting it based off the Die of Fate result way of doing it. I think if you leave it to the chance of rolling on the table, you're going to end up with some weird outcomes that may not make any sense for the sort of pacing of your story, and it may not make any sense in terms of like the danger level of the moment, right? And so I use the Die of Fate to give me a general sense of how hard it should be, and then I pick from the table, adjusting those
Okay,
monsters
that's
accordingly.
interesting. What I usually do with this kind of thing is I do roll the table as written, but I will do it in advance of the session, so I've got time to think about what it means and how I might use it.
That's a good approach too. Yeah, I like that actually. Um, I don't mind doing it on the fly, but I'm pretty good at adjusting on the fly though, right? And actually, that's a great segue to the next bit of this, which I think is going to be really important to talk about. Obviously, the big difference with D&D versus World of Dungeons here is going to be NPC and monster stats, right? Armor class, hit dice, spells, all that business. How do you make that work in World of Dungeons? I know you have some thoughts on that, Tom. Why don't you do this part?
Well, okay. What do I do? I generally don't worry about it too much. I use hit points as written usually, and if that is too much for them to handle, then they'll figure that out pretty quickly. Armor honestly is not that big a deal in World of Dungeons, and because armor class methods and standards vary a lot between different versions of like D&D and OSR systems, I usually can't be bothered to figure out what they are. So if something's wearing armor, I give it more hit points because mathematically grinding things down, it's kind of the same.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, though, you're right. You don't want to get into a battle of attrition. That's really boring in World of Dungeons. But fortunately, you don't really have to worry about that because after the first kind of 3 hack and slash type rolls, your players will get bored and start thinking of other things. And secondly, there is no hack and slash in World of Dungeons. There's only the roll. Okay. And so what I do is on my GM screen Google Doc thing, which is not really a GM screen, it's just a list of notes. I have a section that says there is no defy danger. And what that is a kind of list of a few little templates for me to think about any kind of action roll in different ways. So, excuse me. So, for example, I'll sometimes allow, like if someone's doing a strength-based attempt to fight off a foe, that could become effectively like a Ben Barsliff Gates roll in Dungeon World. Like it's about how much stuff you destroy that you don't want to destroy while you're wrestling this thing out of your way, and so on. And that allows you to let ingenious problem solving skills come to the fore rather than the more tactical system mastery stuff that, to be fair, Into the Fire I think expects you to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's terrific. For me, I'm pretty loose when it comes to NPC and monster stats. I rarely follow the exact number of hit points because, I mean, even though I think World of Dungeons characters of an appropriate level can handle it, I just don't. I don't want the war of attrition. I don't want the slog, right? Like I'm just not interested in it. And you're right. The mechanics do take care of a lot of that. It lets you abstract a lot of it, but I tend to just like kind of come up with, I don't know, sort of like average numbers of hit points that make sense to me.
Yeah.
I will say, if you want to stick with the exact number of hit points, which I do think works, consider doing the following. If the player characters get a 12 plus, per the rules, they get a bonus, right, on a 12 plus. Let their bonus be to simply kill the creature, right, regardless of how many hit points are left. That's a nice way of keeping it challenging because they still have to get the 12 plus, while also giving you some off ramps in the combat, right? Like, and I make very generous use of this. Like, if they're in the middle of a fight with an owlbear, it's going a little poorly. The owlbear, messes them up a little bit. They get a couple hits on the owlbear. The ranger gets lucky and gets a 12 plus. I let him describe killing that owlbear, right? That back and forth of like intense tension and danger and struggle posed against, oh man, like the 12 plus like magic thing that just lets you finish it, right? That feels good at the table. It may seem like cheating to a more traditional player, but it's not. It actually has a really good kind of like feel in terms of pacing. So consider that. And also, you've already alluded to this, but if you're going to use the exact number of hit points, if you're going to present 20 ogres, right, like get your player characters in the habit of thinking about challenges in terms of problem solving instead of like just straight up hack and slash. Okay, so kind of segueing from this idea of NPC and monster stats, I would like to just throw out there that I use a set of pretty simple versions that allow characters of lower level to handle aspects of the adventure. Into the Fire, for example, that they're not like level wise really ready for necessarily, right? So Into the Fire, like I said at the outset, anticipates that this is a huge number of player characters, right? 6 at a minimum, right? Huge number of player characters of a very high level. And like I said, I was running it with like low level World of Dungeons characters, right? So what I do is I tend to use just like a really simple like encounter scale in terms of hit points and damage, so that I can give the player characters a challenge and give them the feel of the module, the feel of the danger, the feel of the monsters, while still giving them a chance to survive it, right? And so for man-sized creatures, for example, I give man-sized creatures about 6 to 10 hit points, and I have them do about a d6 or a d8 damage. If they're particularly tough, maybe I have them, they have a few more hit points or they do more damage, something like that. Larger creatures, I'll give 12 to 20 hit points, and they do about a d10-ish damage, adjusting up or down as needed. These scales are really great for Dungeon World too, by the way. They're even more appropriate for Dungeon World, I think. So that's kind of how I do it. I have those little scales for roughly man-sized creatures and roughly larger creatures when I just need like a quick conversion, right? Importantly, though, and I think this is the key element here, don't forget about fictional positioning. In World of Dungeons and games like it, in Dungeon World, the hit points and whatnot are less important than the fictional positioning. The fictional positioning is the real danger, right? Like if you think about the classic that classic article that I think Sage Latora wrote about the 16 hit point dragon, like Dungeon World's famous 16 hit point dragon, which everybody loses their minds about. Super instructive, right? Because the danger of the dragon is, how do you get close to the dragon? Right? How do you even survive its cone of fire when you're standing, 100 paces away? How do you get close to the dragon? How do your piddly weapons even penetrate the dragon's scales, right? You never even get a chance to get to the 16 hit points, right? Those 16 hit points assume that you are so awesome and so prepared that you're able to actually get a hit in on the dragon. That is super important. And I find that really, really satisfying versus D&D, which just says, well, your characters have 60 hit points and you do X number of D6s or D10s of damage. The dragon has 400 hit points. Have at it. And no other consideration about like whether the character should be able to hit the dragon or not. That's all highly, highly abstract by just with just numbers, right? Like the difficulty, the strange odds of these small characters facing off against this giant dragon is represented purely by numbers. And in World of Dungeons and games like it shouldn't be. So if they're facing off against the dragon, I don't give a shit about how many hit points the dragon has ultimately. What's more important is how do they even get close to that dragon, right?
Right, and Into the Fire, as you know, you've alluded to, kind of does that. It gives you the fictional positioning to make life tough for the player characters.
That's why I love. That's why I said earlier. I think the dragon encounter is the pièce de résistance of this module because I mean, it was almost like it feels almost prescient. Like we intend for the encounter to go this way, right? We don't care about the back and forth, right? It's very refreshing to be such an old adventure.
Yeah. One thing I'd quickly like to add about converting to World of Dungeons, and I guess Dungeon World, is that especially in second edition AD&D materials, you'll often find loads of characters are like a third level fighter or whatever. Like every second town watchman has levels and play character classes. So for particularly tough, usually human NPCs, so like in Into the Fire, maybe the wolf were, however the heck you pronounce his name, group leaders are champions. I like to make them do something like taking the best 1d6 out of 2d6 that you roll. So they're never doing more than an ordinary person would do with, you know, stabbing someone with a dagger, but they are doing it more consistently. And I feel like that gives them a nice sense of menace and competence at whatever they're doing.
Awesome. I love it. Yep. Before I continue here, Paul and Tom, I want to look at my notes to see if there's anything else I want to say. I have a few more notes, but this is already going pretty long. So
it's really long.
Yeah. Yeah, I do want to say it. I'll rush through it though. All right. Some final little notes about converting modules to World of Dungeons. Remember that you can do custom moves in World of Dungeons. That's the whole point of World of Dungeons, in fact. If you see something in the module that you think would be particularly fun to highlight, give it a custom move. For example, Into the Fire, you might think that the Mount Torch volcano explosion and lava sequence is really cool. And so you might want to make a custom move there to highlight how fun and important that part of the module is. On-the-fly custom moves are a skill you should develop, and they're very easy. You just roll whatever the stat you're rolling is. On a 10 plus, you do the thing or avoid the thing. On a 7 to 9, you do the thing or avoid the thing, but there's a penalty of some sort, maybe damage or a -1 forward. On a miss, if you choose to define the miss, you don't do the thing and the GM fucks you over in a very specific way. On-the-fly custom moves, great.
And also a good off-ramp from combat, as you mentioned earlier, as well as your 12 plus option. Do a thing like in video games where the big monsters have an obvious, well, not an obvious weakness, but if you identify the weakness and you stab it with a knife,
big glowing orb on their head or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
And finally, don't forget about the Die of Fate. The Die of Fate is king. Does flame detect the party? Well, who gives a shit about his rod of alertness? Roll the Die of Fate. Are these deep gnomes hostile to the party? Maybe. Roll the Die of Fate. Is there a chance the Galeb-Dur are sleeping when we attempt to go through their choke point? Maybe. Let's roll the Die of Fate and find out. Make the Die of Fate a major part of your arsenal. Learning to interpret the result is half the fun of GMing World of Dungeons. And so with that, let's go on to companion adventures.
It turns out we have a lot to say about this module.
We do, as it turns out. Yeah, we really do. Okay. Companion adventures. I don't have very many. I was really thinking about characterizations and how to characterize certain monsters and NPCs in this module, and I came up with a couple. I think for Flame the Dragon, I don't think you get any better than Benedict Cumberbatch's performance of Smaug in the Hobbit movies. It's quite good and right on the money for me. In fact, I think Flame is Smaug, so it's very, very appropriate in that sense. Yeah. Note, I checked out the animated Smaug from the old animated movie. Not nearly as good as I remember. It turns out it's very hard to make an American accent sound ancient and awe-inspiring. Second characterization. If the party ends up talking to the Galeb-Dur, that's the sort of like stone rock men, my party did, check out the Rockbiter from the Never Ending Story. That is exactly how I imagine Gauntlet doors sound. This very deep, slow way of speaking, and indeed that is how I characterize them. I also wanted to do one for Les Scales, the Wolfware, but I can't think of anything. I was hoping maybe you might have a Les Scales
I was just
characterization.
looking at this note while you were talking about the previous two, and the thing that's come to mind is if you ever saw the Neverwhere TV series from like the 90s, and the Marquis de Carabas, the sort of roguish know-it-all who is in that, he would be perhaps a good role model. I'm sure you can find that on YouTube somewhere.
I'll take it. Yeah. My party didn't encounter the Wolfware, and so I didn't have
That's
to
a
come up
shame.
with anything, but which I thought was too bad. I really liked it in the text. What about your recommendations? What do you have for companion adventures?
I just went tried other media stuff. So music, Shostakovich's Symphony Number 2 in B major, aka October. Actually, just the beginning of this, right? It's got a really tremendous basso profondo opening that I think is good for a recurring theme, and then you let it play on as the entrance music for the dragon. Actually, a lot of Shostakovich's stuff is good. He's definitely one of the top 10 Russian composers, and certainly the best who ever made the cover of Time magazine dressed as a fireman. My other recommendation is actually the XCOM video games. I think are a bit like this bit of high-level D&D in that you're all tooled up with your cool high-tech weapons, but you don't really know what's going on under the fog of war in the middle of the map. And the only way to find out is to go and look. And usually, right, the way that this game is structured is that you've seen all but one of the different types of alien that you're about to encounter, and so that one is always the nasty surprise. And yeah, so the atmosphere of that I think is quite good for Into the Fire.
My last one, I'm cheating a bit. Uh, so we recorded our 5 session run of Into the Fire using World of Dungeons. I'm going to recommend it not as a way of seeing exactly how the module goes, but rather to see how a group that is intent on doing collaborative fiction uses my establishing questions and other things to pretty dramatically alter the main thrust of the story. Our version of Into the Fire is like a sort of weird alternate universe version of Into the Fire. The basic outline is the same. They're moving through the mountains to get to the dragon, but the details are pretty different. So it might be kind of fun to check that out. It's also just a terrific example of how I personally run World of Dungeons. And so that's our show. Listeners, touch with us. I recommend going to our G Plus community. Just go to G Plus and search the communities section for the Gauntlet. You will find us. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a Twitter. It's at gauntletrpg. We are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
No, thank you, Jason.
Oh, hey, Tom, while I've got you, I know we're ramping up for that new game of D&D that I'm going to be running, and I wanted to know if you have come up with your characters yet.
Well, I have, yeah. So obviously, I can only have one. I've got two ideas. I thought maybe you're the DM, so you should pick really. Let me just run them by you, and like maybe if you've got any follow-up questions or things that you want to like, hammer out, we can just do that quickly. So, all right, here's his number one. Could be starring in your game. Male human ranger. His name is Paul Gascoigne. His animal companion is a wise salmon. He's a pretty standard ranger, except, okay, this is the good bit, he's subject to the arcane magics of a wizard, which is both a blessing and a curse. So his sword hand is made entirely of bread. It functions like a normal hand, and it's like crusty enough to hold medium weight objects. But if he gets it wet, it becomes soggy and limp and a bit useless. But on the other hand, he never goes hungry because he can nibble a bit off his hand and it grows back later. So that's one, all right. Two, Jinjivo, a female dwarf fighter, bog standard dwarf fighter, except she was recently struck in the brain by a cosmic beam emanating from our own planet, planet Earth. And that beam originated in the mid to late 80s, so she can only now speak in lyrics from the solo work of Belinda Carlisle, not the Go-Go's, or Paul Simon's album Graceland. So yeah, that's what I've got. What do you reckon?
I think I'm going to go with the bread-fisted salmon ranger.
Okay, cool.
I don't know how that segment went off. We'll get Paul's. I had no idea.
Let's see. I don't know.
I had no idea. I don't know. We'll get Paul's thoughts on it. Paul, we're going to get your thoughts on that. I thought it was really amusing, but I don't know how to react to it. Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I can't do a reader letter. It's just this podcast has gone too long already. We'll only
I
do it
know.
if we're like at half an hour or something, I think.
Awesome. All right, let's stop recording.
Yeah, okay, let's stop. Let's save. Yes. Okay.
What sorts of follow-up questions might I have been asking just then?
Like how breakable is the bread hand? Or do you think you could actually do the dialogue for the dwarf? Like, can you give me some examples of a conversation? That kind of thing.
Were you ready to do those things?
Well, no, not really, but I think that would be the gag. We're just trying to shoehorn circle in the sand into everything.
We'll see. Well, we'll get Paul's opinion on that.
Yeah, that might